Earlier that everything is connected, but that's not quite true. The Harper government is not connected. It's not connected to us, it's not connected to BC, it's not connected to the Canadian rainforest, it's not connected to the environment, and we need to change that. And our best shot, the best connection we've got is sitting in the front row right now. She is the hardest working MP in Ottawa. So let's stand up now on this good earth and make the earth move for Elizabeth May.
Oh, thank you. I was afraid everybody would go home, they'd hear Brian's great presentation, he'd feel tired, but I guess not. Thank you for being here tonight. I particularly want to say what an honor it is and what fun to have Arthur Black here. It is absolutely true that we met for the first time on Parliament Hill on Earth Day 1990, which was the 20th year in a row that I'd celebrated Earth Day because I started it out in Earth Day April 22nd, 1970, when I was in 10th grade and I organized in my high school. And I thought it was pretty cool when Farley Mowat and Arthur Black came to celebrate Earth Day on Parliament Hill with me. And I wasn't planning on talking about another aspect of today, because actually tomorrow, of course, is Earth Day. We're on Earth Day Eve. We now stretch it out as Earth Week. I, by the way, am convinced that Stephen Harper and Joe Oliver misunderstood the whole purpose of Earth Week. They thought it was W-E-A-K, and that the importance was to weaken environmental laws during Earth Week, that was their whole theme for the week. But the Barry Commoner quotes brought to mind for me, Arthur, that this is, in addition to being the night before Earth Day, April 21st, 1838, and Vicki will know what I'm about to come to, was John Muir's birthday, the founder of the Sierra Club. Sierra Club's been around since 1892. But John Muir sort of presaged or was prescient in relation to what Barry Commoner would later say. The way John Muir put it was this: whenever you get hold of anything in the universe, you find it's hitched on to everything else. So that's the view of everything is connected to everything else. I do think, by the way, that Stephen Harper is connected. He is connected to oil money right around the world. It's always we're being run right now. There's no word for it. I've come up with a new word, actually, for what we're run by. Some people think it's a dictatorship. No, we're still a democracy, but we are currently living in an oligarchy. It's a new concept. It requires that we commit ourselves to something that was done, centuries ago in a different context in terms of large institutions, and one that was in the wrong place dominating the state. We used to talk about the need to separate church and state. It's now time to separate oil and state. That is what we currently face. So what I thought I would do, because Brian's done it so well in terms of showing you what Enbridge said in its joint review panel, I will try not to take too long, because I'm hoping we'll have time for questions and answers. But I did bring the latest federal budget, and I did bring Transport Canada's report to the joint review panel. And having gone through it all, I thought I'd just sketch out where we are politically. I am going to end with the 3-point plan to stop this, which is a really good plan, so please stick around. But where we are right now is rather bizarre. We know that Stephen Harper has promised the leadership in Beijing that this project is going ahead. I don't know why that's not found more shocking coast to coast, because the government of British Columbia hasn't given a go-ahead, by the way. And Christy Clark, of course, is ducking the issue. But there's going to be an election in British Columbia, and certainly we can't duck the issue forever. The province of British Columbia has to say something. And as by a margin of 3-1, British Columbians do not want super tankers full of oil on our coasts, then we know that we have a right to say no. And yet it's all being glossed over, and the fact that while a review panel is going on and people are presenting evidence, we have a government that's prepared, and a prime minister, who's prepared to go to Beijing and promise them, it will be done, don't worry. Don't worry, he must have assured them in Beijing, where they must have some doubts about the ability of a dictator in a democratic country to deliver on a promise. Because after all, they have a communist Politburo. They don't have to worry. So he said, don't worry, it's going to be done. So how does he do it? These are he has bent the entire machinery of government and public policy to his will to deliver on the promise to Beijing. And the elements of making this happen, I'll sketch them out for you in short form because they've all taken place in a remarkably short period of time. I've watched it unfold. By the way, I love being a member of Parliament. I'm having a really good time. I should mention that. I love it. Sometimes I think in Ottawa that I'm watching a bad sci-fi movie. How many of you saw Invasion of the Body Snatchers, right? Where there's these little pods that go out, and there's people still walking around, and they look like the people you used to know, but they're not. They've been overtaken by, alien mutant forces. So the same thing's happening in Ottawa. Transport Canada still walks around like a real department. Environment Canada is still there, and there's still a Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency, and there's a Parliamentary Committee on the Environment. But they're pod entities. They're no longer the real thing. The first sign of this was when the Parliamentary Committee on the Environment began the mandatory 5-year review on the Environmental Assessment Act. This is required by the legislation, which, by the way, I helped work on back in the early 90s when I worked as I was working in the Minister of Environment's office, 86 to 88, and we actually, at that time, charted the course for federal environmental assessment law. The law came into force in the early 90s, and it's now being rolled back and destroyed. It's not being streamlined, it's being destroyed. The first sign of this was that the 5-year review that happens periodically, obviously every 5 years, goes to the Standing Committee of the Environment in the House of Commons. The usual review time is about a year, because they hold hearings, go across the country, find out how the Act is doing, recommendations. They started the review in September. I went to a couple of the Committee on Environment hearings, became alarmed that the Conservative members of Parliament on that committee didn't seem to understand the purpose of environmental assessment or how it worked. So I went to the chair of the committee and said, look, I think I need to be a witness before the committee. I know it's a little odd, but he said, okay, well, write, Mark Wara from Langley, he's a nice guy. So he said, write a letter. So I thought I was going to be a witness to the committee. There were a lot of people lined up to be witnesses to the committee. And in the fall, after 9 days of hearing witnesses, and these aren't full days, mind you, these are 3-hour hearings, 9 different days the Committee on the Environment met, when suddenly, to the surprise of all the opposition members of the committee, and I'm not a member of the committee, but all the opposition members of the committee told me they had not seen it coming at all. It was announced that the committee hearings were over, they'd had enough witnesses, 9 days, and they're going to proceed to write the report. The writing of the report then moved in camera, which means all the meetings of the Environment Committee from the fall until sometime in March were held in secret and no one could be in the room. Not me, not my interns, not the media, not anyone, and nothing that goes on in those rooms once the committees move in camera can be discussed. That was phase 1 of moving this in the direction which they wanted. I recognized at the time what was happening. If you're pulling the plug on a committee in the fall and telling them to write a report right away, then you know you want to destroy the Environmental Assessment Act and the budget, for which you need a defense and a justification, and you need it cranked out in time. You work backwards from the timeline of the budget. I realized what was happening. The next thing, of course, was the early January volleys. The first one was Stephen Harper going on a radio program hosted by a guy named Dave Rutherford in Calgary. I don't know how many of you have lived in Calgary and know that radio show. Stephen Harper doesn't provide himself or make himself accessible to media much, But on January 3rd, he went on the Dave Rutherford show and he said, you know, we have oil tankers in Atlantic Canada and the Pacific coast is no different. I don't see why we can't have oil tankers on the BC coastline. It was kind of out of nowhere. And then he began to talk on the Dave Rutherford show about foreign-funded environmental groups. 2 days later, Joe Oliver's so-called open letter came out with a very clear set of messages that environmental groups and First Nations, and frankly anyone who objected to Enbridge constructing a 1,200-kilometer pipeline through the Rockies to Kitimat to deliver bitumen crude to oil supertankers, while at the same time twinned to deliver a toxic condensate called diluent, a petroleum product that would be mixed with the bitumen so that it could flow through the pipelines going the other direction. He announced that anyone who opposed this in Joe Oliver's letter is described as a radical. And then again, they went on about jet-setting celebrities. There one goes now, right on cue. So the sketching out of the agenda in that open letter was part of all this. That was all just leading us to the budget. By the time we got to the budget, I wasn't that surprised. I wasn't surprised to see that they decided to crack down on charities, as if there was something wrong with US-based charitable foundations deciding that protecting Pacific salmon that swim from the US to Canada might require conservation efforts in the US and Canada. It's the same US-based charitable foundations that fund some of our hospitals and universities. But we know that when the Harper budget talks about charities that accept foreign funding and may be too involved politically, they don't mean our universities and our hospitals. They mean our environmental groups. So I was surprised, though, when I read the budget to find that they'd allocated $8 million new money to the Canadian Revenue Agency so that it could crack down and harass charities. So what does the budget say about oil tankers and the topic tonight? Essentially, this entire, it's called Jobs, Growth, and Long-Term Prosperity Economic Action Plan 2012. This is a budget that could have been written by the oil industry. It's so unbalanced. It doesn't even mention climate change. I thought at one point when I was reading it, and I had to read it fast in the budget lockup and then run back to the House of Commons, and all these little yellow tabbies and all this horrible mess that you see I made of the budget, I did in an hour speed reading it. And I kept thinking, it must mention climate change in here somewhere. I was looking for the renewal of funding for the Eco-Energy Project, which with home energy renovations. I'm sorry, I don't know what's wrong with my throat. Could it be I gave too many speeches on Earth Week? Anyway, my eyes, you know, if you ever flash read something looking very, very fast, I finally saw the word climate, and I zeroed in to read the paragraph. It was about the investment climate. So at that point, I realized it's not in here, is it? So the section on oil tankers I thought I'd read you, and then I'd go very quickly to Transport Canada and very quickly to my three-point plan. This is at page 97 of the budget for those of you who have it at home and want to look it up later. It says, under supporting responsible energy development, Economic Action Plan 2012 proposes $35.7 million over 2 years to support responsible energy development. This means tankers. The paragraph begins, safe navigation of oil tankers is very important to our government, with a capital G. Oil tankers have been moving safely and regularly along Canada's west coast since the 1930s. For example, 82 oil tankers arrived at Port Metro, Vancouver in 2011. Nearly 200 oil or chemical tankers visited the ports of Prince Rupert and Kitimat over the past 5 years. They all did so safely. It goes on like that. You would think we didn't have a moratorium in place since 1972. You'd think that Brian's maps of the exclusion zones don't exist. The mantra of these guys, and I asked questions of the Minister of Transportation in the House of Commons, and I get the answer, oil tankers have moved safely. We've had 500 trips on the BC coast. Oil tankers move safely on the BC coast. So having come across, reading that in the budget, and I decided, when I saw Transport Canada say that tanker traffic was safe and there were no reason for anyone to be concerned. I don't know about you, but I found when the news covered that Transport Canada had appeared before the Joint Review Panel and pronounced that oil tankers on our coastline were safe, it was quite a double take, because I hadn't seen any evidence leading up to the idea that the Transport Canada had the mandate to do that or was about to do it. This is the report. It's called the Turnbull Review Process Report on the Enbridge project. I won't get into it with too many details, but there's some things I must share. Number one, of course, they rely on the Enbridge report, which Brian has so skillfully dissected for us. It reminds Brian's presentation put me in mind of a Stephen Leacock line. Stephen Leacock once said, in ancient times, they didn't have statistics, so they had to fall back on lies. Anyway, this document reads with long lists of what are called risk reduction strategies. And they go through this, which you've heard about now, the tethering, that a requirement for ballasted tankers to be accompanied by a close escort tugs available for ocean rescue, tugs equipped with oil pollution emergency response equipment, requirement for laden tankers in a confined channel area to have 2 escort tugs, 1 tethered, simulator training. It goes on and on. It's under a headline of commitment to implement voluntary measures. These aren't even going to be required by any regulations. These are voluntary measures. The other thing I thought was, well, when am I going to get to the part about how they're going to navigate the Hecate Strait? I mean, after all, as Brian alluded, and it's in Environment Canada's reports, by the way, not to the Joint Review Panel, but Environment Canada's document, Marine Weather Hazards Manual, quote, the Hecate Strait is the 4th most dangerous body of water in the world, unquote. That statement from Environment Canada is not found in Transport Canada's document, which claims to have been developed with the help of Environment Canada. It doesn't mention, for instance, as John Valiant, I have a wonderful quote from his book Golden Spruce, in which he calls the Hecate Strait, he says it's arguably the most dangerous body of water on the coast. The strait is a malevolent weather factory. On a regular basis, its unique combination of wind, tide, shoals, and shallows produces a kind of destructive synergy that has few parallels elsewhere in nature. He goes on to point out that sometimes these blind rollers that roll without braking are capable, let me find this, with winter surges eastward through Dixon Entrance at heights of 10 to 20 meters, and the fact that a large enough wave will expose the seafloor of the Hecate Strait. That's not mentioned in Transport Canada's report. What they do mention is how wide a tanker is and how wide the passages are. And you can't believe this. It's like, will it physically fit through? This is what you're laughing. It's what they say. Here we go. The proponent conducted navigability studies, la-da-da-da. Okay. The largest oil tankers being considered for the Northern Gateway project are 70 meters wide. The narrowest segments of the proposed shipping routes are about 21 times the breadth of these vessels. Well, there you go. It'll fit. And not only that, it's going to, they say the tanker needs a channel depth of at least 23 meters. A channel depth of less than 26.6 meters would be cause for concern. The entire proposed north and south tanker routes are more than 36 meters deep, with one exception, a 35-meter patch near the northern entrance to Principe Channel. That one can be easily avoided. And the Learmouth Bank, 26.4 meters in Dixon Entrance, must also be avoided. This is what they're talking about. In perfectly still waters, when everything's perfect, you can fit a tanker through. I read this with growing levels of alarm. The other thing, of course, that they make clear, and Brian hinted at this, the tankers aren't controlled by Enbridge. Who knows who the strangers are who pull up with the tankers? They're not part of the review process. They will, of course, be likely coming from China because, after all, this is not about Canada delivering a Canadian product produced in Canada to a new market, as it is presented to us by Stephen Harper. This is about the Chinese-owned state oil industries, Sinopec and PetroChina and NAOC, which have now invested upwards of $12 billion into owning resources in the oil sands, being able to take the bitumen crude to the Enbridge pipeline, which I now call the Great Pipeline of China. You can picture it that way, up and down over the hills. Right? The Great Pipeline of China, which PetroChina says it wants to build. The business pages of the Globe and Mail casually noted that Chinese proposals for building are often competitive because Chinese proposals use Chinese labor. Building the Enbridge pipeline across northern BC to Kitimat, where Chinese supertankers will pull up to take the bitumen crude to Chinese refineries, where Chinese workers will refine the crude, instead of what the unions in Canada want, refine it here. Now the link with, yes, that's a sensible thing to do. The link with China gets weirder. There was 2 days ago, it was just reported in the Globe and Mail yesterday, a completely secret visit. It wasn't announced, but a man named Ling Chang-chong, Mr. Li, is the head of the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda unit. He's the number 5 man in the Chinese hierarchy, and he paid a visit to Stephen Harper. It was entirely private. He visited Ottawa. He was in and out. The media got no notice of the fact that this high-ranking Chinese official was coming to visit. I note that my friend Judy Tetong is here tonight, who's very active with the Canada-Tibet Committee. His Holiness the Dalai Lama will be visiting Ottawa on Saturday. I'm searching in vain for any indication that Stephen Harper will be meeting him in similar private circumstances for a tete-a-tete. We abandoned human rights relating to China some time ago, and we've opened ourselves up without any Investment Canada scrutiny of whether there are any national security concerns about this. There are a lot of concerns. So here's my 3-point plan, because I must move quickly. 3 steps for an oil-free coast and a healthy democracy. Step 1, become very loud. Letters to newspapers. I know that doesn't sound loud. That's just something you do at home on your computer and you send it. But we really need, particularly the newspapers in central Canada, the Globe and Mail, the National Post, to understand for British Columbians that this is not going to be allowed to happen. That this is not a debate that we're having here. This is us saying no, and what part of no don't they understand? We need to explain about the Hecate Strait, the fjords up to Kitimat, Kitimat Arm, the whole reality that it isn't, as Brian says, if a tanker spill will happen, it's about when a tanker spill will happen. Oh, and by the way, in the budget, they just shut down the Emergency Response Office of Environment Canada to deal with oil spills. They've consolidated 5 offices to 1 office in Quebec. So I think the advice to British Columbians will be, if you see an oil spill, go to your computer and Google oil spill, what the hell do I do now? And you'll get instructions. Become very loud. Also, you can go on those websites, you comment on news stories, constantly push back on the people in denial, and constantly make the point this is not in Canada's best interest. It's not even in our economic best interest. It makes no sense to be exporting our bitumen crude as fast as we can possibly boil it out of the sands of Alberta, because we're still importing more than half of all the oil we use from Angola and Venezuela and Nigeria, because Eastern Canada gets foreign oil, and we're shipping out bitumen crude as fast as humanly possible. Get very loud and support the environmental groups that are now under assault, and support First Nations. We can't just continue to expect that First Nations will carry the load and be in the front line on this unless we find ways to act in solidarity. Point 2, yeah, oh good. Point 2. Really put pressure on the provincial parties in this province and the leaders of those provincial parties. We know Jane Sturk's sitting over there, leader of the Green Party of BC, so we can count on her to be saying, if she's premier, she will stop this project. What I don't know is why Adrian Dix is not saying, if I'm premier, I will stop this project. I don't hear him saying it, and I don't hear Christy Clark taking a position. We really need to focus the efforts. I shouldn't do it as a federal politician and leader of the Green Party federally, but British Columbians, as British Columbians, we need to ask provincial government leadership, where do you stand and what will you do? Because legally they cannot build a pipeline over British Columbia territory if the British Columbia government says no. That's important. And point three, step three of my three-step plan. This is my favorite part. Stephen Harper has to go, like immediately. It's not, and the thing is, it's doable. You're right, Gordon Campbell, all he did was lie to us about the HST and he left. Think of all the things Stephen Harper has done. That he, contempt of Parliament, all the times that he's, presenting us the evidence, telling us that we were going to be spending money on reducing congestion at the border and we were really channeling $50 million to Tony Clement's riding. Or telling us that we're going to be, he's not going to touch pensions, except for the fact that old age security is going to move up to 67. I mean, we've got a litany of things that make Gordon Campbell and the HST look he's like a piker compared to Stephen Harper. And yet we sit around and act as though there's nothing we can do till 2015. So the call that Canadians need to make that Stephen Harper must go, must resign, must leave, is not fit to be Prime Minister of this country, and must resign now. And if he doesn't resign, we have to throw him out. And that's my promise from Ottawa to you. And I say that knowing that it might sound like hyperbole, it might sound like a faint hope, but I do know climate science, and I know if we have someone who's Prime Minister of this country till 2015 on the science on atmospheric chemistry, it's too late. And I do know that this is a Prime Minister who, having stated that if you oppose this particular project of Enbridge and tankers and risky tankers on our coastline, if you oppose it, we're called enemies. If you oppose it, in the House of Commons, Conservative members of Parliament have actually said that if you oppose this project, you are, quote, unquote, against Canada. And when asked to withdraw her comments, it was Parliamentary Secretary Shelley Glover, when asked to withdraw her comments, she said, no, she would not, because it's very obvious anyone who's opposed to Canadian resource expansion and selling bitumen crude to China, if you're against it, you're against Canada. So that's why I don't believe, we've got a government that's decided that it's okay to change the Environmental Assessment Act and have it changed retroactively as it applies to this project. This is just outrageously anti-democratic. And that's why I just wanted to share it with you because I think it cheers people up. Just need you to know I'm really committed to seeing Stephen Harper out of office this year. So thanks so much for coming tonight. Harper must go. Thank you.